All our stories so far have been from the Old Testament. Have you noticed when you've been listening to the stories that they are all stories about people who really trusted God, even though they had to do things they didn't really want to? Now we're going to hear some stories from the New Testament, and this week's story is about Jesus when he was a boy and how he went missing one day. Jesus is God's son, but he lived with his mother Mary, her husband Joseph. Jesus was both human and also God. They all lived in the village of Nazareth. Joseph was a carpenter, and as Jesus grew up, he helped him. Just like any other boy, he would play games with his friends. Jesus, however, was different from other children in that he was always obedient to God and Mary and Joseph. He did not do wrong things. After Jesus was born, Mary and Joseph had children of their own, so Jesus lived in a family with his stepbrothers and stepsisters. He also went to school, where he studied hard. One day Jesus was very happy. It was time to go to Jerusalem with others from Nazareth to worship God in the temple. It was something that they did several times a year. It took a few days for the large group of people from Nazareth and the surrounding area to walk to the big city. As they climbed up the big hill to Jerusalem, they sang psalms and praised God. Finally, they went into the temple where people were teaching about God and worshipping him. Jesus was pleased. After all, his real father was God. Jesus was now 12 years old, the age that most boys began to learn how to do the job their father did. Many people came into the temple to pray to God. Some people came into the temple to say sorry to God for the wrong things that they had done and ask him to forgive them. Teachers taught people how to obey God and live by his laws. People could ask questions and find out how God wanted them to live. Some, however, were very proud and came to the temple to show off how good and generous they thought they were. Some people were impressed by them, but they did not please God. There were musicians in the temple who led people in singing praise to God. It was a wonderful time as people ate meals with their friends and family and put their lives right with God. After a few days, it was time to return. The large group of people from Nazareth started to make their way out of Jerusalem. Mary and Joseph thought Jesus was with the other children, making the journey home, or with their relatives. But later, after travelling all day, they stopped. They called out for Jesus, but there was no reply. Where was he? They asked people if they had seen Jesus, but they all shook their heads. "Have you seen Jesus?" shouted Mary and Joseph to those travelling at the front. "No, we haven't seen Jesus all day," they answered. Mary and Joseph were very worried. Had Jesus been left alone in Jerusalem? They must rush back at once to find him. The next day they arrived back in Jerusalem, tired and exhausted. They went through the narrow streets but could not see Jesus anywhere. They searched all day but could not find him. The day after, they kept looking. They asked people if they'd seen a 12-year-old boy on his own, but people shook their heads. They searched all day, but there was no sign of Jesus. Jesus had now been missing for 3 days, and Mary and Joseph were so worried. They decided to go to the temple and ask God to find him. They did not know it, but Jesus had been in the temple all that time. It was God's house, his Father's house. Jesus asked difficult questions about God to the temple teachers. They could not answer them, so Jesus explained about God to them and answered their questions. People were stunned that such a young boy knew so much about God. a boy who is only 12 years old. From where has he received all his wisdom? Mary and Joseph began praying in the temple. Suddenly they gasped. There was Jesus, talking with the temple teachers. They rushed to hug him. "Where have you been? We've been so worried about you." "Don't you know that I am 12? I am the age when I must learn my Father's business," Jesus replied. Mary and Joseph understood Jesus must do what God wanted him to do with his life. After all, God was his Father. Jesus wisely knew God's command that we must all obey our parents, so he set off at once with Mary and Joseph on the trip back to Nazareth. Jesus grew up being obedient to Mary and Joseph and God. He grew strong in every way, loving his heavenly Father and his parents on earth. And that's the end of our story today. I hope you enjoyed it, and there's activities that you could do. You can find them on the website after this story.